Professor J. Scott Jordan, Chair, Department of Psychology, Director, Institute for Prospective Cognition, Illinois State University, is a cognitive psychologist who studies the neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy of cooperative behavior. Interestingly, in the Body, Mind, Self podcast, he describes himself as, quote, "I'm a cognitive scientist by day and a philosopher by all time," unquote. Professor Jordan has over 150 publications, and I would suggest you Google Wild Systems Theory once, and you would get a peep into a significant part of his overall. Professor Jordan has 5 edited books to his credit: Intercorporeality, Emerging Socialities in Interaction, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Contextuality from Physics to Psychology, published by Springer in 2015. The Concepts of Consciousness, Integrating an Emerging Science, published by Imprint Academic in 2007. Modeling Consciousness Across the Disciplines, published by University Press of America in 1999. And lastly, Systems Theories and A Priori Aspects of Perception, published by Elsevier in 1998. The most fascinating aspect of Professor Scott's profile is that he regularly contributes to Sperling's Popular Culture Psychology series and other outlets to reveal connections between pop culture narratives, psychology, and the realities of lived life. Examples include exploring the hidden kingdoms of assumption, interview with Christopher Priest on Black Panther, culture and the art of changing minds, and the welcoming Spider-Verse, finding yourself in a web of others. Another very charming side of Professor Jordan's profile is that he has published a peer-reviewed scientific song about the self titled "It's Hard Work Being No One," which received a positive review in Discover magazine. Interestingly, he wrote the lyrics and teamed up with Illinois State music students to record the song. I would really recommend that you listen to the song, which is titled "It's Hard Work Being No One," in the December 2018 edition of the journal Frontiers in Psychology. Professor Jordan is also co-member of the WGLT Psy Geeks podcast and has appeared on the Body, Self, Mind podcast. He's a co-organizer of ReggieCon, a virtual Comic-Con panel series that celebrates diversity and heritage months during the academic year. He also produces the Dark Loops Productions channel on YouTube, where he hosts discussions of lived life, science, art, the humanities, and all things pop culture. He's also extremely proud of his international comic book collection. A very warm welcome, Professor J. Scott Jordan. Very excited to listen to your inaugural talk. I had the privilege of listening to Professor Jordan's talk at the University of Arizona. And believe me, the next 45 to 50 minutes are going to be the most mesmerizing for you. So over to you, Scott.
Well, my goodness, thank you so much. I don't think I've ever been introduced at an intellectual conference where people actually say nice things about my comic book collection and my pop cultures and that are. Dr. Bhatnagar, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for all your help getting things ready for today. I have to tell you, I absolutely love the idea of this conference. All throughout my career, I've never really felt at home in one discipline. I have often found myself giving the right talk in the wrong place, or the right talk, or the wrong talk in the right place. Very rarely is it the right talk at the right place at the right time. So I'm delighted to be here. And just before I start, just condolences to all of you out there. You have suffered through this pandemic. All I can say is best to you, and hopefully we'll get through this as a species soon. So what I'd like to talk to you about today, let me make sure I do this right. So the title of my talk is Wild Narratives. Oh, wait a minute. Can you see my talk?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you
we
very
can.
much.
Yeah.
No problem. So wild narratives, science literature, and the transdisciplinary nature of being. Sorry about that. Science literature and the transdisciplinary nature of being. And I want to start by saying that our models of what we are and what we live in necessarily constrain and contextualize our models of what science and literature are. So for example, we can believe we are spirits in a material world, and we can see that has an impact on literature and as well as science. We can believe ourselves to be informational minds in a physical world. And of course, that's where a lot of dystopian science fiction comes from. We can also believe ourselves to be physical minds in a physical world, hence the naturalistic reductionism we tend to live in the Western world. And we can also discuss the idea of quantum minds in a quantum world, which opens up all kinds of field-related possibilities and opens up different ways of thinking. The present paper proposes that these models I just talked about are actually stories, or what I want to call wild narratives. They are narratives because they are about what we are and what we live in. And they are wild because they emerge at the intersections of choice and chance we encounter during our lived lives. So how and why do these wild narratives come to be? The answer is a story. And it's a story about how feet tell stories. For example, feet can tell fun in the sun stories. Feet can tell love stories. So how do feet tell stories? Well, feet tell stories by how they move. So what I'm showing you here is the architecture, neuroarchitecture, minimalistically of how we would actually move our foot. So here in the motor cortex, neural signals move from the motor cortex to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord out to our muscles. And those muscles contract, i.e. we walk, we talk, we move our arms, whatever. And when we do those movements, all kinds of effects are produced in the environment. Sounds, vision, smells, all those effects of that movement then feed back to the parts of the brain that were used to plan that movement in the first place. Now this loop between the plan and the outcome takes about 120 milliseconds. That means that we should really only be able to control about 10 movements a second, if you like.
Professor Scott,
Yes.
I'm so sorry I'm interrupting, but I think your slides are not moving. So we can just see the,
okay,
opening
hold on,
slide.
let me try this then.
Sure, thank you.
No, I appreciate you interrupting me. Because
So sorry about that.
No, this is much better. There's no bad here. We're all good. All right. So you missed all my beautiful slides about feet stories.
We
It's
did. We did.
I tell you what, so, you know, there goes my feet stories, right? Fun in the sun stories, love stories. How do they do it? By how they move. I got to do this one again. I'm sorry, but this is kind of important to what happens afterwards. Basically, what I was trying to say is that when you want to move your leg, a plan generates in what's called the motor cortex, and neurons in the motor cortex then send signals to the spinal cord, which then makes those muscles contract because it sends signals to the muscles, they contract. And when you contract your muscles, when you walk, when you talk, when you move your arms, feedbacks from those movements are fed back into the motor cortex. And that loop takes about 120 milliseconds, meaning that we should be able to control about 10 movements a second. But if you've ever seen Jimi Hendrix play guitar, Stevie Ray Vaughan play guitar, any fantastic musician, you know that we can generate movements and control them at rates much faster than 10 movements a second. Well, the reason we can do that is because we're controlling those fast movements on stories. And here's what I mean. As these signals in the motor cortex project to the spinal cord, copies of those are also sent to a very old part of the brain known as the cerebellum. Now, those neurons in the cerebellum also receive the inputs or the effects that resulted from this movement plan. So what happens here in the cerebellum then is the brain's able to correlate what was supposed to happen and what did, what I just like to call command feedback regularities. Now, what's really fun about this loop is that these neurons, which are receiving the plan and the results, actually then send project neurons back up to the motor neurons that influence them in the first place. This loop takes about 10 milliseconds. So here's what this means. As a baby learns to, for example, grab a ball, and it reaches out and it misses, and it reaches out and it misses. So what's happening is all these plans are being generated in the motor cortex. The feedback indicates didn't work. Kid does it over and over and over. And finally, something does work. When it does work, what happens is the moment that the infant plans to reach out to grab the ball, not only is the spinal cord influenced, but so is the cerebellum. And what we have in the cerebellum is memories of how those plans proceeded in the past. So what happens is, as soon as the baby plans to reach and its arm is starting to move, the cerebellum primes the motor cortex planning with memories of what was planned before. This loop takes 10 milliseconds. This then allows us to basically control our bodies on memories, okay? Now, different people have called this loop different things. So roboticist Kawato refers to it as anticipatory motor error. Philosopher Andy Clark refers to it as virtual feedback. And biologist Paulin refers to it as dynamic state estimation. What I just want to call it is neural recursion. What that means is that you have a neural process that is actually recursing on itself. What that neurodynamic is doing is actually producing effects that ultimately come back and influence that neural process itself in a recursive loop. So the concepts that you see there, anticipatory, virtual, and estimation, all, by the way, generated by people from vastly different disciplines, they all refer to the stories told by feet. They are stories because they are about the foot's future, and they are derived from what the feet have done in the past. So they are being generated all the time, and we don't even notice until we're surprised. I suspect all of you can remember a time when you were walking down the stairs talking to your friend about perhaps the latest episode of Game of Thrones, and suddenly you find yourself falling down the stairs, all right? And that moment that you tripped, you suddenly become very conscious of your foot. But what you don't realize is that the whole time you were talking to your friend, you were actually generating unconscious foot stories about the pressure your foot should sense on each step. And as long as your story matched the feedback, you didn't have to pay conscious attention to it. So we're usually pretty unconscious of these stories we're telling ourselves until we're surprised. So in foot stories, the past primes the present as an anticipation about the future. So how are other types of stories told? And it turns out they're told the same way. They're told by how they move. It turns out that this recursive relationship between the motor cortex and the cerebellum actually exists for every aspect of the cerebellum, every aspect of the cortex. This means that every time you use your cortex to think, every time you use your cortex to plan an action, every time you use your cortex to perceive, that cortical activity is simultaneously activating memories of how you've acted, perceived, and thought in the past. So for example, I'm sitting here talking, I don't know how many words a second I'm generating, but I have no conscious access to how I'm generating all these movements with my mouth. All I'm doing is controlling the ideas that I'm putting up, but all this movements on the throat and the breathing, all of that's being controlled by these unconscious narratives. Let me just give you a quick example, and I need you all to look at the screen because it's a pretty high-tech demonstration, all right? Here we go. Every one of you knows exactly what I'm going to say. Now, some of you may have kind of heard the word next. Some of you may have kind of heard the word now, even though I didn't say it. What that means is you were experiencing me in terms of your unconscious stories about how words in English go together. And all I had to say is, you know exactly what word's going to come next, because as soon as you started to hear that, it primed your memories of how those words go together. And you sort of heard it waiting for verification from me. But two other things happened. Not only did you know that I was going to say the word next, you probably had a sense that my hand was going to stop moving. Every one of you knows what word I'm going to say next. So you experienced my hand movements in terms of the anticipation of it stopping. Another thing is you had experienced the pitch of my voice in terms of it eventually bottoming out when I was finished saying what I wanted to say, right? And in English, this is how we take turns and talk. When you hear the pitch of my voice bottom out, you know that it's someone else's turn to talk. So you were experiencing the pitch of my voice, the movement of my arm, and the cognitions I was generating all within these anticipatory frames, and you never feel yourself generating those anticipations. What I study in the lab is how these anticipations develop and how they actually create a framework for our experience. So I'm going to argue we live in multiple scales of storytelling, anticipation, narrative construction simultaneously all the time, and we're only aware of it when we're surprised. So for example, we're constantly telling ourselves stories about our body. For example, how do we know if we've tripped? But we're also telling ourselves a story about the relationship between our body and the world. For example, should I keep to the center of the path? Stories about future body-world relationships. Is this the right way to the lake? Stories about abstract world-world relationships, such as I wonder what this forest will be like in 100 years. And all of those different stories are active at the same time for you as you move through the world. Because these stories develop spontaneously out of your lived life, they are wild stories. They are stories about how you have moved your body, moved your perceptions, and moved your ideas over the course of your life. And you live in them constantly. So how does society influence our own individual wild stories? And I'm going to say it does so by cramming stories down our throats every single day of our lives. So here's a little cartoon. A caveman comes home from the hunt. He hasn't caught anything. And he says to his wife, I didn't actually catch anything, but I feel I gained some valuable experience. Now, on the one hand, that's a good joke, but he's absolutely right. For as he's out in the world generating body-world relationships over and over every day, what's happening is those neurodynamics and the memories of moving his body in relation to that world are being embodied in the structure of his cerebellar cortical loops. One of the more unique aspects of human species is our ability to unload certain aspects of that embodied experience back into the world, as we can see here in cave paintings. Now, what do those cave paintings do for us? What those cave paintings allow us to do is actually shape the world of others that we're with. And by shaping the world of others that we are with, we can actually cooperate with each other in this imaginary world of stories, right? So we take these externalized abstractions of our narratives and we create increasingly abstract developmental contexts, such as the world that kids are born and raised in now versus even 50 years ago, are just markedly different in terms of the abstract narratives we live in and sustain. So we go from externalizing some of our embodied narratives into the environment, and instead of running towards prey, what we do is we get it to chase us so that we can get it to run over a mountain, and it's much easier for us to capture it. What that allows us to do then is capture energy, so we can spend our time not chasing prey, but rather sitting around a campfire, developing more sophisticated stories about how we could do this more efficiently and get what I want to call more information per unit work, more outcome, more abstract outcome per unit work that we spend. This then transforms over the course of human evolution and cultural evolution into the changing the world from cave drawings to actually creating libraries, housing that libraries with books, which can be seen as the embodiment of our wild narratives, which then ends up giving rise to weird things like Tokyo, right? Where you have all these buildings here that are about no one. They are about everyone. They invite everyone to be there. And it's just weird, what I'll call abstract virtual reality. We've been living in abstract reality much longer than we think. We've created an external world that's about all of us. So on the one hand, it sounds cool that we tell these wild stories and we're telling them all the time, but why? And this is the thing that we often overlook. We tell ourselves these memory-driven wild stories so that we can distinguish our bodies, our perceptions, and our thoughts from those of other people. One of the coolest experiments I've read in the past decade. What you have there is a father finch teaching a child finch how to sing. Now, the way this works is that the father sings. And the way that the baby's brain is constructed, the baby hears the father with parts of the brain it would use to plan its own singing. Now, what this means is that when the father sings, he basically takes over the planning brain of the baby and kind of via remote control gets it to sing. Now, that's just the mirror neuron story, and I'm sure most of you have heard of that. It's been around for a while. What was unique about this study is as follows. What they found was that as soon as the baby's brain had learned a certain portion of the song, the baby's brain started to inhibit the impact of the father, so that the baby didn't start automatically singing every time the father sang. Now, on the one hand, it's like, why would it do that? And the reason is so that it can be an individual. So it can sing when it needs to sing, so that it can flap its wings when it flaps its wing needs to, instead of just doing it whenever it sees a conspecific flapping its wings. The point here is that we have this natural mirroring connection with each other. And then what the brain does is actually call out an inhibition of that resonance with others. And it's that inhibition of others that actually scopes out what we would call a self. Now, on the one hand, that's nice data for birds, but we also have data from human beings. For example, data indicate that people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia are actually able to tickle themselves more easily than non-diagnosed people. Now, the reason for this is because when I reach out to tickle my hand, I guess, what happens is, as I plan to do this, my plan actually changes my brain's sensitivity to that area of my body. So my brain is taking into account what my planning will have, the impact my planning will have on my brain. It turns out that in those diagnosed with schizophrenic, those cerebellar cortical loops, that tracking of what I'm planning doesn't function the same way it does in non-diagnosed persons. Therefore, when someone who's diagnosed with schizophrenia goes to tickle themselves, it's harder for them to distinguish that as being the result of their movement versus someone else's. And so it's easier for them to tickle themselves. But this also accounts for why those diagnosed with schizophrenia experience hallucinations and delusions, because their brains are generating experiences, but they don't experience themselves as generating them because they're not tracking their planning. So just right now, all of you are hearing at least, well, you're not talking, I'm sorry, but all of you have at least two thoughts in your head, right? The thoughts that are in there because I'm talking and you're listening, and then the one where you're saying, oh my gosh, he's right. I can tell his thoughts from mine, right? Those who are diagnosed with schizophrenia have a hard time doing that because these memory storytelling systems aren't working the way for them that they work for us. So by constantly having our memories prime our actions, our perceptions, and our cognitions, we are able to distinguish our thoughts from those of others, our actions from those of others. So that's sort of a wild systems tale about what a self is, and the idea that we constantly tell ourselves stories and we live with them. So what I want to do now is start talking about what science might be in this wild systems framework, because the goal is for me to talk about what science might be, then talk about how it might be related to literature, and in the end, transdisciplinarity. So I'm going to argue that science is a cultural practice that affords members the ability to generate increasingly sophisticated, reliable models, what I'll call wild narratives, of the larger scale contexts in which they are embedded. So I think we all agree we're in something. Some people want to call it physical, some people want to call it a universe, whatever they want to call it, we're in some context. And for me, what science is a practice that actually allows us to create more sophisticated narratives about what we are in. What I'm trying to say here is I don't use science to find some kind of objective truth. And we'll see what that means in a second. Now, in wild systems theory, by describing persons, cultures, and science as nested within reality, the wild narratives perspective avoids the epistemic gap the Western world created between material and spiritual realities hundreds of years ago. And I would argue we're still living in that gap. So here's what I mean. I'm going to tell you a story about how some people believe that we exist on the other side of reality, that your taste of ice cream exists on the other side of what's truly real. Because when in most of the ontologies, most of the philosophies of reality that I encounter as a cognitive scientist, most begin with the idea of how do we know that those trees are really out there? And the basic epistemology is one of correspondence. And what that means is there's a real tree out there, and what electromagnetic radiation, light, refracts off that tree, enters my sensory systems, and I generate a representation of that external reality inside of myself. And what I know then is this representation. So if you like, when we talk about these things, we almost act as though these trees out there, those are the really real things. This stuff inside of me is basically an impression of what's really real, what we call an impression, a representation of external reality. When we get sophisticated talking this way, we'll call those things out there objective trees, and we'll call the things in here subjective trees. And then when we get really sophisticated, we'll call the things out there observer independent trees, and we'll call the things in here observer dependent trees. Okay, so I talked a lot there, but I wanted to make a specific point. I want us to pay attention to how reality is being defined. Reality in this model, what I'll call the correspondence model, reality is being defined as existing on the other side of observers. Reality is being defined in terms of how it is different from experience. That's the important point, is that somehow we believe that that which is most real exists outside of us and therefore is objective. And the stuff that exists inside of us, our pain, our love, our hate, our depression, that's subjective and therefore not as real. And if you really trace out a naturalistic reductionism, there's even an argument about whether or not my pain and my love of ice cream actually even exist. And this is what we're led to when we describe reality in this way. This way of talking about reality, which the Western world has done since Christianity and is just basically kept by transforming the spiritual into physical. So then now we have a physical correspondence work, subjectivity, physical brain, objectivity, physical external world. It leads us to believe there's this huge gap between what's in here and what's out there. What it also does, though, that's important to what we're talking about today, is it argues that science is about objective reality, while literature is about subjective reality. And I think that's a real problem. First of all, I'd argue it's logically incoherent, and we can talk about that later. But I also think what it does is it makes us think of science as revealing some kind of real truth, and then literature revealing some kind of less real, more subjective truth. And I think as a scholar, that's in the end a logically incoherent way to think. And as a human being, I think it's a dangerous way to think. And we can talk about that later. Now, the wild systems framework was meant as a way to overcome that epistemic gap. And by describing persons, whatever we are, as being nested within reality, my taste of ice cream is in reality, so that can never exist on the other side of it. The wild systems narrative, what I do is conceptualize organisms as embodiments of context. Such embodiments of context are naturally and necessarily about the context they embody. Now, here's what I mean by that. My bones, my muscles, my brain, all of these in my lungs can be seen as an evolutionary embodiment of the constraints that have to be addressed to move this mass as a whole through a gravity field. So instead of looking at my bones and my muscles and my brain as kind of isolated things, I like to look at them as embodiments of the context in which I've had to sustain myself, both as an individual as well as a species as a whole. Because I'm an embodiment of the context, I am therefore naturally, and this is philosophy language, but I'm naturally and necessarily about those contexts. I am naturally and necessarily about gravity. I am naturally and necessarily about oxygen. Therefore, we can conceptualize ourselves, we can conceptualize living systems as embodied aboutness. And I argue that organisms are meaning. The reason we think that organisms have to create meaning is because we start off by thinking of them as physical systems, which means that they don't have meaning. Somehow meaning doesn't come into existence until we have subjectivity. What I want to argue is we don't need to think that way. If we look at ourselves as embodiments of context, then we can see ourselves as being naturally and necessarily meaningful. There is nothing about us that is meaningless. All right. And this makes life a whole lot more difficult. For now, instead of finding meaning, we actually have to manage it. We are meaning. Some would say tragically, meaning. And life is about managing what we're about. So as embodiments of context, living systems are wild narratives. Just like my actions, just like my perceptions and my thoughts, my body emerges within and embodies context. And it does so at the intersection of choices and chance. The science of embodied context, which sounds kind of funky and weird, but it's actually been going on for a long time. It's just been going on in different disciplines and different disciplines at different times. So for example, instead of looking at what we're in as the physical world and then trying to talk about objectivity and subjectivity, there are those, this particular scholar being Odom, argued that what we're in is most coherently modeled as a self-organizing energy transformation hierarchy. Now here we have two visual depictions of that idea, and I'll go through them in a second. What that means, self-organizing. Self-organizing means that what we find in here, in this context, doesn't come from outside of context. It comes from within context. There's nothing here in reality that didn't emerge out of what is in reality already. So there's nothing outside of reality reaching its hand in, making things turn out a particular way. Hierarchy, what this means, and I'll use this image here, if we start with low quality energy from, let's just say, the sun, by low quality here, all we mean is less structured. It's just energy blasting off of the sun. But what we have is systems on Earth that have evolved the ability to capture that energy chemically, and we call those plants. Now, what those systems do is actually capture the energy, capture that raw sunlight, take it in, transform it in ways that sustain plantness, and simultaneously dissipate products involved in that energy transformation. Then once we have a plethora of plant life available, now there's an energy source for the emergence of a new type of energy transformer we would call a herbivore. And then of course, herbivores give rise to a context that affords the emergence of carnivores, affords the emergence of humans, affords the emergence of credit card companies, right? That was a joke, but it's actually true. Credit card companies are predatory. All right. So you have this hierarchy of energy transformation. The point I want to make here is I've described reality now, and I've not used the concept physical or mental at all, and I'm never going to use them again. And I don't need to. And that's kind of what I want to show you here. So if we're going to talk about all of this as an energy transformation hierarchy, I have to tell you how you can be you. How can a single cell be a single cell in a constantly fluctuating energy environment? And it was Stuart Kaufman in the mid-90s who proposed that what we call living systems are actually self-catalyzing chemical systems. Now, what that means is here you have a chemical reaction between A and B. A and B produce a product, and that product feeds back in to the A-B interaction. What that means is if A and B interact and they produce some product, that product actually keeps that reaction going, that will be called an autocatalytic or autocatalytic reaction. Now, chemical, all right. So what Kaufman wanted to say then was that living systems are self-metabolizing systems. The work, and when I use the concept work here, I'm talking energy transformation. The work produces products that actually sustain the work, what I like to call self-sustaining work. And I'm talking self-sustaining work from the level of a single-celled organism all the way up to the level of a culture. There's a hand raised. I'm not sure how the House wants me to handle raised hands. I'm happy to answer a question. I'll leave it up to the moderator.
Sure. I mean, if you want to take the question, you can. I was wondering if you could do the Q&A like after the talk, but if you want to take a question, Professor Scott, go ahead.
Well, how about I answer clarification questions during the talk, and then I'll answer big questions after that. So the hand raised. Please go ahead with your question if you can.
Yeah, it says Oppo. I can't read your name, so if you could just unmute and talk in case you have a clarificatory question.
I'll tell you what, why don't we just go ahead and get through the talk, and then we'll make the whole transition to bringing people in. Is that cool? Oh yeah, because I get these technical details. By the way, just as an aside, thank you so much for doing all the production it takes to bring 227 people together in a Zoom room at the same time. It is not easy. I've tried it, and I truly appreciate it. So here's what I want to talk about. I'm talking about living systems as self-sustaining energy transformation systems, not physical, not mental. And I'm going to keep that through the whole talk. What I'm going to also argue is once you have these autocatalytic systems on our planet in a context, self-sustaining systems that emerge are themselves self-sustaining. So for example, in 1949, Donald Hebb developed the notion of the cell assembly. And the idea is that neurons that fire together wire together. Now, since that time, what we've discovered is actually when neurons generate action potentials and release neurotransmitter across a synapse, there's also a retrograde process that goes from the synapse back to the nucleus that causes a genetic transcription process that actually gives rise to synapse growth. What does that mean? It means generating action potentials, doing that work actually gives rise to a product, genetic transcription, that actually keeps generating action potentials going. Another way that people might talk about this is positive feedback. I just don't like that concept. But not only do neural networks behave according to this principle of self-sustaining work or autocatalysis, Jerry Edelman taught us in the 80s that the entire brain develops that way. So it turns out that the brain is actually continually generating new neurons up till about 5 years old. And then after about 5 years old, continued change in the brain has to do more with synapse formation than it does new neuron generation. All right. The neurons that survive are the ones that we use, the ones that engage in action potential. So you can almost think of the brain as an ecology. And when neurons are firing, what they're actually doing is, you can say they're sending information if you want, but what I like to say they're doing is actually living. What they're doing is feeding themselves, feeding each other. And then actually, B.F. Skinner in the 1950s discovered that behavioral work, for example, this gentleman climbing up in the tree and grabbing the apple, as soon as he picks that apple and eats it and releases that chemical energy actually goes back into the system and restores all of the systems, the bones, the muscles, the lungs, all the systems that actually gave rise to capturing that apple in the first place. A guy by the name of Mark Bickard then pointed out that all these different levels of self-sustaining work are recursive. That means that neurons influence networks, and networks influence the brain influences the body, and vice versa. And then what I've tried to do is bring all of this together into a thing I called wild systems theory, as I've been talking about here. The point I want to make is from single cell organisms to human cultures, the science of embodied contexts is the science of being. It is the empirical investigation of aboutness. It is the study of meaning. Most scientists would tell me that they're not studying meaning unless they're a linguist or a semiotic, unless they're doing semiotics. But what I want to argue is there's nothing that is meaningless. So doing science is doing science on meaning. Physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, and literature studies all constitute scholarly attempts to understand the patterns that exist at different yet yoked and nested scales of embodied context, scales of aboutness, scales of meaning. Transdisciplinarity is the scholarly examination of meaning across multiple levels of scale. Science and literature do not reflect objective and subject realities, respectively. Science and literature reflect different modes of engagement with the multiple scales of context we embody and sustain ourselves within. So are there narratives out there in the world of literature and art that are consistent with the wild systems notion of us being embodiments of context? Well, my favorite author of all time is a German guy by the name of W.G. Sebald in this amazing book called The Rings of Saturn. And here's a quote from The Rings of Saturn. From the first smoldering taper to the elegant lanterns whose light reverberated around 18th century courtyards, and from the mild radiance of those lanterns to the unearthly glow of the sodium lamps that lined the Belgian motorways, it has all been combustion. Combustion is the hidden principle behind every artifact we create. The making of a fish hook, manufacture of a china cup, or production of a television program, all depend on the same process of combustion. Like our bodies and like our desires, the machines we have devised are possessed of a heart which is slowly reduced to embers. Now, not only is that beautiful prose, but it's completely consistent with the idea that what we are is embodiments of context, and we sustain ourselves by burning energy in that context, by taking in, transforming, and dissipating context. In Sebald, we see a narrative of organisms and cultures as energy transformation systems that necessarily intake, transform, and dissipate energy in order to sustain themselves. So instead of seeing ourselves as physical beings with spirits, what we see ourselves as being is existing in reality, necessarily modulating it through energy transformation for the purpose of sustainment. We can come to see ourselves as entropy engines. Life and culture simultaneously and inescapably generate order via the creation of disorder. One of my favorite animated movies of all time is Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke. It tells the story of a young prince, Ashitaka, whose remote village is being attacked by this beast. Ashitaka tries to protect his village from the beast, and as he does so, you can see the beast's tentacles reach out, put a scar on his arm. He's actually expelled from his village because he's been cursed by this demon. And on his trip westward to try to figure out how to remove the curse, he runs into this monk, Jigo. And the point I want to make about this story is the inescapability of nested context. The act of caring and working for change is cursed by infinite unintended consequences. There is never an opportunity for us to escape the unintended consequences of our being, because we are embodiments of context and cannot escape context. And here's a quote that the monk states when Ashitaka shows him his arm and says, "I am cursed and this curse is going to kill me." And the monk says, "These days there are angry ghosts all around us, dead from wars, sickness, starvation, and nobody cares. So you say you're under a curse? So what? So's the whole damn world." Now, on the one hand, that sounds cynical, but what it speaks to is what I'll call the beautifully ugly curse of being. As entropy engines, we cannot create stability without generating instability, without breaking something down. Coming to grips with that view of what we are is kind of important. And then I think the best thing ever put on American television is a HBO series that was 3 seasons long, started in 2003, called Deadwood. It refers to a silver mining town in South Dakota that is not yet incorporated into the United States. The mining town is on Indian land. And so what you have is a very unstable social dynamic. And the only person in the town capable of generating any order at all, whatever that might mean, is the quote unquote evil man who runs the local saloon and keeps the town in order in a way, in the same way a sort of mafioso boss would do so. And what I like here is how the idea that when we try to sustain order, when we try to make things happen, we always do it in conflicting contexts. And what's beautiful about this story is when people make deals in the Silver Town, instead of signing their names on pieces of paper, they spit in their hand what Derrida called the identity sustainment through eminence, through my body, through my presence. And what you see then is the emergence of these eminence-driven identities actually putting X's on contracts, trying to manage their identities representationally as opposed to eminence. And you see what's happening is the representational form of identity basically consuming the eminent form of identity. And the poor guy, evil guy who has to run the town says things like, in life, you have to do a lot of things you don't blank want to do. Many times that's what the blank life is, one vile blank task after another. So the point here is perhaps what we're witnessing now in culture is a cultural level resurgence of holism, which was actually a pretty popular Western idea in the 17 and 1800s in science, art, and culture in general. Our need to distinguish our own actions, perceptions, and thoughts from those of others historically led us to believe we were inherently disconnected, which in turn afforded the emergence of narratives regarding an epistemic gap. Now, as our lives become increasingly interconnected via the internet and media, the wild narrative of our status as embodied context becomes increasingly integrative. As embodiments of context, we are thoroughly and inherently meaningful. Science and literature are two modes of examining the inherently transdisciplinary nature of our being. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Scott. I think that is what transdisciplinarity was supposed to do, to make you think beyond your own discipline. Some of these terms were so new to me that my head is still reeling and is still trying to grasp my head around those terms. But if I could just take a very feeble go at, asking you some questions, and then we can probably take the questions that have been typed out in the chat box.
I love it.
You started off by talking about how reality is constructed on several levels, right? There's multi-scale stories that we sort of create around ourselves, and that is primarily what wild narratives framework sort of brings reality down to as well.
Right.
While and then we, as embodied contexts, the idea of us encompassing whatever meaning making, knowledge production is happening around us in terms of our socio-political context, right? So while this idea could be very liberating, as we do away with certain socio-political contexts that sort of restrain ourselves and our understanding of the other that we at times end up marginalizing. My question was, do you think this could be a reversal as well, in the sense that, when I do away with the socio-political context, how do I locate and where do I locate this invisibilization of embodied contexts? Certain bodies in certain contexts are invisibilized culturally, socially, politically, economically, especially when we create this kind of a binary between the East and the West, right? Because we started off with this concept of, creating this epistemic gap in Western context. And specifically when we're talking about, post-colonial societies like India. I belong to South Asia, right? So the Western understanding of, let's say, political modernity, democracy, all of these concepts have often been seen in post-colonial studies as being superimposed upon, these societies. And, there's a lot of invisibilization of these embodied contexts, right? And post-colonial theories, specifically in South Asia, are talking about it. So where do you think would this cognitive science locate this kind of invisibilization in the socio-political cultural context? If I've been able to make sense.
No, I love that question, because in the United States right now, my wild systems work is focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? And creating a context for more nuanced, what I call making the invisible visible, right? You talked about invisibilizing. What I've been writing about recently is, why would anybody ever invisibilize anyone? And the reason that you would ever invisibilize anyone is as follows. If I see a human, if I see a dog, if I see a cat, if I see an organism suffering, what it means for me to see that suffering is to experience that suffering. So, because the way the brain is set up, if I see suffering, I experience your suffering with the same parts of my brain I would use to experience my own suffering. So when we're talking with other people, we're actually giving each other influence over our psychic states. That's how we experience. So I think a lot of invisibilizing goes on, because then I find ways to not let you influence my empathy. I generate a culture where you or some group a narrative is generated about somehow them being different from our group. Now, we call that dehumanizing. What is it? What it is it's a cognitive mechanism that allows me to not feel guilty for ignoring your suffering. In other words, I can say, well, that person, they're just second-class citizens. What the hell? They just came here to take our jobs, right? And why would you ever say that? Well, the reason you're saying that is because what I call dissonance to virtue. You're experiencing the dissonance of not showing that person empathy. The suffering comes to you as a function of what we are, and what we have to do is work to keep the suffering out. But what the human species does is, instead of me running into every single person and having to decide in the moment whether or not to allow their suffering in or to keep it out, I just construct a world that keeps the people I don't want to be around away. So I live in a certain neighborhood. I have a certain job. I wear certain clothes. I drive a certain car. And what all that stuff does is keep my empathy boundaries clear. And I very rarely run into those people that I've invisibilized, to the point where they actually are invisible, because I don't see them, right? So one of the advantages, I think, that the wild systems framework brings to our understanding of invisibilization is that there's a cognitive gain for the invisibilizer, and that gain is the avoidance of the suffering that they're generating in the world because of the life they live. And by the notion of dissonance to virtue, not only do I find a way to ignore your suffering, but I make myself highly moral for doing so. So one last thing, in the United States, about a year and a half ago, we saw the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And this was a way to protest police brutality against Black Americans. Well, rather quickly, another rhetorical organism emerged, and it was called All Lives Matter. Now, why would anyone ever say all lives matter? Well, because once I've said all lives matter, I basically said you're wrong and I'm moral because I'm saying everybody's lives matter. So very rarely do you just say, I don't like you. What you do is you create a cognitive device that allows you to not like them, to invisibilize them, and at the same time feel morally superior for doing it. And then that just gets built into your world, your car, your house, and your school system, all of it, what we would call a class system. So I love the question, and it's precisely where, you know, I see wild systems as being incredibly helpful and incredibly useful, because I don't ask my students, are you racist? Because they think that means so they have racist thoughts. And they can say, no, I never had a racist thought in my life. And I said, well, let's not look at racism as being in your head. Let's look at the racism as being what stays in the same in the world because of the way you live your life. Every time you go to that store, participate in that economic system, go to that gas station, pump that gas in your car, you are sustaining an infrastructure, what I call infrastructures of suffering. And the beauty for the dominant culture is they don't ever feel bad about it, because I moved into that rich neighborhood so I could send my kids to good schools, not so that I could keep Black people away from my kids, but I could. So I'll stop there. I love the question, and I hope the answer made any sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Thank you so much. But let me quickly go to the chat box and see if I can pick up some questions from there. I think there's a rebuttal. Linu, if I'm pronouncing that name right. Wiki. All right. Okay. So there's a rebuttal. So
Yeah.
would you want to ask a follow-up question? Is that what it means? And would you want to talk about it maybe? Could we unmute? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. The professor was talking about how when someone talks about the problem, the other person also says that all lives matter and as such. So I was just saying that they are using a rebuttal as a form of that they're not actually empathizing with the problem, yet they're just trying to overshadow the problem with another problem of theirs.
Yeah.
While simultaneously making themselves highly moral for doing that. That's the thing, is your emotions are going to be involved. Your emotions are going to be involved. So what you do is you generate a rhetorical device that makes sure your emotions stay positive for yourself. Yeah, a good point.
Yeah, I think there's another point, and Suman says, of course, can we say that the concept of invisibilizing others to keep our empathetic boundary clear is more of a way to incorporate defense mechanism and justify our own wild story or narratives? That's what I think we've been.
I couldn't have said it better myself. When I'm in a negotiated, when I'm in a setting with people and they're telling me what they should have, what they deserve, what they're owed, I just don't experience those. The question I look at is, what are they trying to keep the same? You know, or you know, what do they want? Because I just don't experience words as deictic pointers to reality. I experience words as what I'll call cognitive skin, right? It's sort of the boundaries of our rhetorical mental space. And it's built to keep us feeling good. It's built to keep us out of self-doubt. And I look at it as an organism instead of deictic.
All right. I think there's a question from Gurpyari. She says, how will you situate transcendental experiences in the wild narratives framework? Since these experiences are the most subjective and individual in nature, do we mean that we cannot even build the narratives around them because they're not inexpressible and are actually beyond description?
What a fantastic question. I'm going to say yes and then get a little more nuanced. So 20 years ago, I was hiking in the Smoky Mountains, and it's always hazy in the Smoky Mountains. A hurricane came through 2 or 3 days before we went. So for once, the Smoky Mountains were perfectly clear. It was about 2 a.m. We climbed up into a fire tower, and and everything was shades of gray silver because the sky was so clear. And I remember standing, pointing my hands at the moon. I know this is sounding what it is, but in that moment, experiencing myself connected to the moon, but also feeling myself connected to the sun, because I knew that the light rays hitting my hand were the second thing those light rays were hitting after they left the sun. They hit the moon, they hit me. Now, I describe that in words, but that doesn't capture what I felt. The thing about what you're calling transcendental experience, it's almost the overcoming of narrative, right? This is what meditation does, is take us into a moment of non-judgment, non-expectation. And what that means is being able to suppress our habit of generating anticipations and narratives about our body, generating anticipations about the people around us. That's just what we do on a daily basis. And getting into these transcendental states, though I don't know the neuroscience, I would argue it's this pure form of feeling part of everything. And it's not cognitive. We have to do maybe some cognitive work to get ourselves to get there, but it's a moment of what I call pure being. And I would say that the experience can't be captured in words because, yeah, like for the reasons you said. I hope that answer made any sense.
Yeah, can I just add to this? So this movement, from conscious self to unconsciousness to subconscious self. So it becomes very difficult, to describe in the researches also, when it comes to writing a research paper on, talking
Yes.
about your inner self. So,
Yeah.
so it becomes very difficult, to describe those moments. So, when it comes to, building, empirical data. So how is it that so what is it that you really rely on, when you have to write those researches, when you have to write those papers? So we always, there's always a gap there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why I became transdisciplinary, right? That, in other words, when I want to talk about being, I'm not writing science papers, right? And when I'm writing science papers, I write in the language of science. And because again, I don't look at language as deictics pointing to reality. I look at language as a rhetorical boundary, as a rhetorical skin around a certain way of thinking. And in order to publish in scientific psychology, I had to learn that rhetoric. In order to publish in philosophy, I had to learn that rhetoric. And then what I did was I just got smart and I started co-authoring with people who are already experts in that rhetoric. And I took second authorship and we just worked together and I let them be the rhetoric expert in that space. But by going into those different spaces, I learned a little bit about what any one of those spaces means and what any one of those spaces, that none of those spaces has primacy, has authority over the other. So empirical science does not have any authority over literature, right? There are different domains of aboutness. And what we do as scholars is we look for patterns in a particular level of aboutness. So if I want to talk about, for example, the phenomenologists, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, Heidegger to some extent, what they did was just examine what it felt like to be and then how that unfolded over time. And then they wrote qualitative descriptions of that. Now, I think that's good scholarship. Just because they can't put a number on it, what they're still looking for is coherence, non-contradiction. They're looking for a robust, non-contradictory description of the patterns they find in their world of being. So what I had to do, if I was going to do this, is just learn that I needed to stop talking about embodied aboutness in scientific papers, because that's just not what's going to get published in scientific papers, and it's not their fault. They have a rhetoric. I needed to go to a space that had a different rhetoric. I've had a blast working in communication studies. I just love talking in that rhetoric. And I've had to struggle to speak in philosophy because it's so dominated by analytic reductionism that it's hard to get an audience as a holist, but I found places. So if you're not getting, if you have something you want to say about your being and science is telling you can't say it there, then write a poem, write a novel, write a song, and don't pretend that science has is the final arbiter on truth. I think that's a dangerous way to look at things. I hope that was an interesting answer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott, for a very beautiful answer. Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
There's one more question around the idea of invisibilization, and I really like this question. I think so. Chaya asks, do you think invisibilization is just Freud's defense mechanism, rationalization at play?
Freud is one of the more underestimated psychologists. People got mad at him because he talked about sex, but his decentering of human consciousness, human conscious intentionality, and his recognition that the past was always expressing itself in every moment of our lives was a brilliant insight that no one else was talking about at the time. Yes, invisibilization is a defense mechanism, right? And let's be clear about it. What it does is provide people mental health. That hurts to say because we like to say mental health is a good thing and that being closed-minded is a bad thing. But in fact, being closed-minded is a good way to keep yourself happy. And I'm not trying to say that cynically. I'm not trying to say that judgmentally. Natural selection favors diversity. Different types of people being in this context in different ways. What you will find is this: the more open you are, the more you have to explain yourself to other people because they're going to tell you you're wrong. Someone who's closed-minded isn't going to open themselves up to the instability your way of thinking is going to bring into their stable world. So when you're in an argument with people, you got to ask yourself, are they up for instability? And don't bang your head on the table when they're not. Just recognize that you need to find other people that are up for some instability, up for some uncertainty, and try to find a way to express yourself in that space. Banging your head against the table for those who are closed-minded is just dangerous for your mental health. You're muted.
One of the demerits of living in a virtual world.
There you go.
Okay, so I'm going to take just one last question, maybe. I think we're running
love
out of time. Tapti asks, while narratives theory calls to mind several propositions of Arne Nai's deep ecology in 1973 and biocentrism, how do you think you've made a departure from the above? If Tapti...
Another great question, because there are no new stories. There's just old stories told in new contexts. In other words, everything I've said here, particularly the notion of embodied context, is actually derivative of Baruch de Spinoza's notion of finitudes. So Spinoza was a Dutch philosopher who disagreed with René Descartes on the idea that reality reduces to two types of substance. And Spinoza basically argued that there aren't two parts to reality. There's one reality. It's an infinite reality. Let's call it God. And then what are we? We are finite bits nested within that infinite reality of God. Well, that finitude can be talked about in the 21st century as an embodiment of context. So the authors that you mentioned, I would not be surprised to find that quite a bit of what I say overlaps with quite a few things they said. And again, this is why for me, rhetoric, words, I look at it more as an organism, the skin of a thought organism, in the sense that people writing in the 70s their work is an embodiment of the context in which they were writing. My work is an embodiment of the context in which I'm writing. And all I can ever hope is that my ideas stay relevant long enough that someone else can embody them in their context someday. And that's the difference between wild systems theory and traditional analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy believes there's a final answer. Reductive naturalism believes there's a final answer to reality. And I think this is a dangerous way to think and a dangerous way to live. So I don't necessarily know the authors you're talking about, but given you brought them up, I'm quite certain there's quite a bit of overlap. And what I would be doing is telling that story in my time.
Does that answer your question, Tapti? Okay, I wanted to end it here, but I think there are two more good questions. Taiba has been trying to ask a question. She's raised her hand. So Taiba, if you could just unmute yourself and quickly ask your question.
You guys are awesome. This is an absolute blast for me. Appreciate it.
What time is it?
It doesn't matter. This is what I live for. Come on. When do I get invited to a transdisciplinary conference? Lord have mercy. It's fantastic.
We are so glad.
Please.
So we're talking about a transdisciplinary approach. So as this is holistic approach, we know that it includes input of those outside of academic discipline like stakeholders and all. But I would like to tell you, ask you that doesn't it affect the professional boundaries? And why do we only talk about transdisciplinary approach when we're talking about the wild narratives? And also, if the research has a low diversity, does it still fall into the category of transdisciplinary approach?
Okay, I'm not certain I understood. Could you state the question again one more time? And it's my fault. I just didn't hear everything I should have.
So I'm talking about the transdisciplinary approach. As you earlier mentioned about the transdisciplinary approach, as we all know, this is a holistic approach.
Yes.
So we take the input of those also who are outside the academic discipline.
Yes.
For example, stakeholders or the sponsors or the planners, policymakers, etc. But
Also, yeah.
doesn't it affect the professional boundaries, and it allows the overlap of professionals working outside of their tradition? And besides, it's expensive and also the time-taking method. And my last thing to say is that if the research has a low diversity, if we are working on a specific research and it includes low diversity, does it still fall into the category of transdisciplinary research?
Okay. I'm going to answer your last question first, and I think maybe it'll circle back and answer the other ones. What I tried to end with is that we are transdisciplinary beings. In other words, I'm not one thing. I'm cells, I'm multicellular organisms, I'm organs. So my being is a multi-scale phenomenon. Now, so in that sense, people can only do work they call people can only do work that they call non-transdisciplinary, or people can only believe they're doing disciplinary work if they've convinced themselves that their level of study exists independently of everything else. Now, holism is a direct philosophical refutation of that belief. So if we're holists, we can never believe that any research is ever wholly disciplinary. So then why then do we have boundaries? Well, I'll agree that reality has joints, right? I'll agree that there are levels of reality. And we tend to organize disciplines around those, and we tend to generate rhetorics to allow us to talk about the patterns we find at those different levels. And we do that so that we can communicate with each other. And I get all that. The thing is, what we tend not to do then is ask ourselves, what limits have we created for ourselves with these disciplinary rhetorical systems? In other words, if I create a system of rhetoric in psychology that describes me as a physical thing that has mental states, I've completely negated the reality of experience, and I don't know it. I'm using that rhetoric so I can run experiments and such. What I've tried to do in Wild Systems is come up with a way of describing reality that transcends disciplinary rhetorics, so that I can get together with a dance ethnologist, virologist, and I can talk to all of these people about the patterns of activity they're trying to bring words to, and not act like one level's bigger than the other, one level's more important than the other, truth resides at one level and not the other, one's a hard science, one's a humanities. Those we can use those rhetorics, but for me, there's so much invisibilization packed into the concepts of science versus the humanities that we end up trivializing literature. We end up trivializing art and see it as pastimes, as opposed to forms of being. So for me, it's political. It honestly is political. I use literature, I use movies all the time in my science classes because the numbers can't give me human trauma. The numbers can't give me human suffering, but the movies and the books, they can. And if we're going to do psychology, then we got to talk about what we're talking about. So I think people are always doing transdisciplinary work because they're in a transdisciplinary reality. They're transdisciplinary themselves. They just convince themselves that they're doing disciplinary work. I hope that answer made any sense. And so if you take that far enough, then yeah, even the non-academy is where we are, right? Even everything we do is about the non-academy, right? So it's all there. And if my rhetoric hasn't acknowledged that, then my rhetoric is incoherent. And therefore I need to reorganize it to include what I've invisibilized. And the advantage of the thinking that way is I'm never going to pretend I'm going to be done. You know, I'm just going to keep moving and deal with the incoherence I face and in life and being and in the scholarship. Thank you for that question. I hope I answered it, or at least tried.
Okay, I'm just gonna, if that is okay, if we are not running out of time, Professor Scott, can we just quickly take 2 more questions, very short questions?
You can take as many as you want. I'm awake and I don't want to go into anyone else's time, but this is a gift for me. So please go ahead.
You're very kind. Thank you. I'm just going to take a question from Gary Sebastian. He asks, what's your opinion on the hard problem of consciousness?
I love it. So the hard problem of consciousness stems from the rhetorical division of reality into physical, mental, objective, subjective dichotomies. And the belief that somehow that's a prima facie, that's just a true description of reality. And what I want to argue is not only is it not true, it's logically incoherent. And there are many other ways to talk about reality. So for example, if I'm an embodiment of context, right? That means that everything about me, everything I am is embodied context. It is embodied aboutness. So meaning isn't something that gets created in my brain. Meaning exists in my fingernails, my toes, my mustache. All of it is about. So there is no hard problem. The things we call consciousness, phenomenology, sensation, those are just evolutionarily scaled up forms of embodied aboutness. The hard problem emerges out of the rhetorical division of reality into an epistemic gap. And what I've been trying to do philosophically for 20, 30 years is find a conceptually coherent way to not have to deal with the explanatory gap. I am not a physical system. Someone can tell me I am, and that's fine. I'll tell you I'm an embodiment of context. And I'd argue that's more coherent than calling me physical. So I hope that short answer solved the hard problem.
Yeah. So one last question. Jana asks, how do you think this kind of cultural influence, where we talk about this cultural embodiment of meanings, which is situated within, which is located on our bodies, I would say, within our bodies, right?
Yep.
How do you think that impacts one's mental behavior and mental health? I'm just adding to that question to just probably... we talked about how this could be a defense mechanism and how this could help save mental health. but how restore mental health. But how do you think this could this be otherwise as well? Could this have a reverse influence, if that makes sense?
So the answer is yes. I mean, there are plenty of human systems that that love to sustain certainty and love to sustain the privilege that comes with that certainty. And there's a lot for them to give up if their thoughts change. And let me just get my thoughts here for a second. There is a lot of threat to mental health, to the mental health of those who are invisibilized, right? Those who are ignored, those who aren't even treated as human, because they know they're being ignored. They don't have the defense mechanism that the ignorer has, because the ignorer has created a rhetorical system that makes them moral for what they're doing. This is God's will. The British Empire was created to bring God's truth to the entire planet. That is the moralization of colonialism, right? And all the suffering generated by that infrastructure, all the dissonance it would put in a colonizer to look at the trauma they're producing in a victim's life, all that dissonance is instantly converted to morality. And that's why that system exists. So it's terribly important to understand when you're in a victimized environment. It's terribly important to understand when you're in a space that is telling you who you have to be. Because when my girls are both biracial women, and I tell them, if someone insults you for the color of your skin, you have to understand it's about them, not you. They need to believe that you're a certain type of person so that they can believe they're a certain type of person. So you become a token, a thing that lets them be who they want to be. And you have to, if you're not aware that people are playing you like that, if you're not aware that people are treating you as their audience for their show, it can ruin your life. I mean, absolutely lead to hopelessness. So this is one of the reasons people go away, go to a different culture, go to college, get the hell out of that place, figure out what's you and what's the road, right? And that, however, takes courage, because you're putting yourself in a space of instability. But it's in that space of instability where you can find out different things about yourself. So the answer is God, yes. Culture is all about telling you who you're supposed to be, right? Because most people want things to stay the same. So in order for it to stay the same, you got to play your part. It's all scripted. And if that doesn't work for you, then you've got to find it in yourself to either push back in that space, or better yet, just get out and go somewhere else where you can be someone else. I hope that all made sense.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Scott. I think this was quite invigorating, and this was a great talk. I look forward to taking some of these narratives forward, at the panel discussion in the evening. Thank you so much. And
thank you for the opportunity.
thank you for being here.